going to keep a tally throughout all of the speakers, and you'll get, I don't know, a big plushie or something. Kate is actually first one announcement. So some of you did not get badges because we were short on the blank ones, or maybe on the ones with the names, I'm not sure. But they found more blank badges, so if you are a poor soul who does not have a badge, you can now get one from registration. After Kate's talk, there'll be a break, so you can pick one up from registration. So Kate's an applications engineer at the Mozilla Foundation. She works on the WebMaker team, but her talk today is, again, the second so far in our theme of actually making the world a better place using technology. So everybody give a hand to Kate.
All right. So can everyone hear me okay? My ears are really small, so this thing keeps falling off. So today I'm going to talk to you about diversity. And my name's Kate, as you heard. I'm a web engineer at Mozilla, and I work on a project that has around 4,000 contributors of many different kinds. And because I work at Mozilla, every single line of code that I write or review is open source. And you know what? I really believe in open source. And I think the reason that a small open source project can actually outperform larger, more traditional groups is actually because we're more diverse. But if we really want to continue to be a changing force in the world, we have to do better. We have a lot of work to do in our communities. And most of you know that, and that's why you're listening to this talk. So when it comes to finding solutions and practically implementing them, which is what I'd like to address by the end of my talk, I think it's worth clarifying what we actually mean by diversity. So what is diversity, and what makes it the secret sauce in open source? So typically when we're discussing diversity, we're talking about how we identify ourselves and how others identify us. So that's identity diversity. And those can be qualifiers like gender or ethnicity or belief systems. And most of the discussion around that kind of diversity is usually centered around power structures and political systems, around communication and equity. And while identity definitely matters, it's also extremely important to recognize that cognitive diversity is important too. And that is the differences in terms of how we think and the experience and training that lead us to think that way. As a society, we're really interested in what individual cognitive qualities lead to creativity and innovation and high performance, but we don't talk so much about how being different can collectively lead to better outcomes. So I want to share some research that I read about by Scott Page, and one of the books that I read was The Difference by Scott Page. And the central premise of his research is that diversity trumps ability. So I'm not going to read the whole model of what cognitive diversity is, but essentially what it is different perspectives and how we use those perspectives to construct models of problems, predictions, and methods for finding solutions. He looked at the problem-solving capabilities of really high-performing but homogeneous groups and compared them to less high-performing, less experienced groups but that were much more diverse. And he found pretty conclusively that the diverse groups performed better. So that wasn't true for all kinds of tasks. Really simple tasks like flipping burgers or lifting boxes, there's basically no benefit. And for tasks that have to be performed by individuals in isolation, the ones with experience were actually preferred over the diverse groups. But where diversity really makes a difference is disjunctive tasks, and that is when group performance is disproportionately dependent on the strongest member. It's also important for solving really tough problems that require lateral thinking and innovation. And that's really interesting because modern software development is to a large extent disjunctive. For any particular problem in a set of problems, different cognitive abilities or combinations of heuristics might lead to better outcomes. Solutions can rise to the top asynchronously. So that's why diversity of experience really matters to open source. So now that you have a little bit of an understanding of what cognitive diversity is, I'm going to show you some things you can actually do that will help you attract more contributors and, more importantly, maximize the value that you get out of those contributions. So let's start with what we know, and that's code. Cognitive diversity is extremely important for good engineering, and we learn that because open source is, to a large extent, disjunctive. Individuals who may not have the most experience will actually come up with better solutions for areas like security, for example. But how do we support different areas of expertise without slowing our contributors down, without slowing our core teams down? One of the best ways is actually to make problems accessible by reducing dependencies on domain knowledge and project history. So instead of attacking your huge code base at once, try to split it up and releasing part of it as modules. So on my team, we actually split up all of our UI code, so our CSS and our HTML, into a separate module so that contributors with a lot of expertise in that part of the code could work on it without having to build our legacy crazy app ecosystem. And it worked pretty well. So the consequences of cognitive diversity is that communication decision-making becomes very difficult. You need to be really mindful of how you handle conflict and how it affects newcomers. So part of that's common sense, you know that, but you also might want to consider a code of conduct. So this has been in use for some time at events. So Cascadia, as you heard, has a really awesome code of conduct. You should definitely check it out. But more recently, they've also entered the code contribution space. So at Mozilla, we have something called the Mozilla Community Participation Guidelines, which is kind of an overall framework for how our contributors work together and what's expected of our behavior. I also found something fairly recently called the Contributor Code of Conduct. It was developed by Bantic, and it's currently in use by a number of projects like Angular, for example. And it basically has some expectations that are specifically around code contribution, like working in issues or pull requests. I think it's really helpful that it's also really close to the code itself in GitHub. And if you want to check it out, that's the link right there. So code contribution's awesome, but I think it's also critical that we expand our definition of contributor so that we can take advantage of the full range of human talent that's available to us, right? I mean, that's completely stupid. It's ludicrous to assume that the only part of what we're working on is the code itself that can be improved by collaborative iteration. Even if you're writing a library, there's chances are there's parts of your project that can be improved by people with different skill sets. So one area of expertise I really want to talk about that's relevant to us is user research. And the thing with user research is that pretty much everyone wants to do it, and very few people have time. It also really, really benefits from cognitive diversity. The kind of user research I want to talk about is user testing, which is a form of user research. So what you do, a lot of people, how many people have used user research on their projects here? Hey, that's pretty good. So basically what you do, I think the best way to do it is to write tests as you implement new features. Basically, if you do it as you're writing your new features and finding problems, and your team actually contributes to writing some of those tests, you'll actually have a good background for contributors to come in and help you out. So when you're making the ask to people who have more experience doing user testing, they'll have something to start with. So there's a lot of different kinds of tests. You have user stories, which are like pathways and tasks. Scenarios allow people to behave situationally. And then you can also test expectations about your UI and your messaging. So for example, if you're running a package manager, these are some tests that you could test expectations for. You could get a bunch of developers into your room and see if what they expect about an error message is actually what it is about. So yeah. Be clear about what you're looking for, though. It's really important to guide your contributors to find people who are relevant to your project. Again, if you're testing developers, you want developers doing your testing. If you're writing a library, you definitely want developers. You also really need around 5 sessions to get really useful information. So we found that user testing done by community actually produced different interpretations and different focus areas despite asking the same questions. And that's really the spirit of taking advantage of cognitive diversity, finding out what people really care about. So to demonstrate another kind of contribution, I really want to talk about localization. And this is something where my team has really found a lot of contributors. How many people know what localization is? Yes, and how many of you are doing it in your projects currently? And how many people think they're doing it really well? Yeah, we felt sort of the same way. So localization is the process of making your software available in different languages or locales. And then it also means going deeper and changing the content or the UI to be more familiar to different cultures. So there's a lot of different interpretations of how to integrate localization in your project, but honestly, it's not that hard. And I'll briefly describe what we did on my project. So the first thing you can do is look at the accept language header in your browser. It's a browser that it's something that browser sends with every request. It's not perfect, but it's a good start. And then for client-side only apps, there are varying implementations of navigator.language, but not all browsers support it. The next thing you want to do is have some kind of routing to support your locale. So we have part of the URL has the locale in it. And then you just want to implement some kind of function that switches key names into the strings for whatever language that's currently selected and have some UI to switch that language. So that's an example of all the key names and then the actual strings in French. So on my project, we use Transifex, which is a community localization platform. And the interesting thing here is that we actually didn't have to invent a contributor pathway. We went to where contributors were and then learned from them. So localization can apply to libraries too. If you have any kind of strings in your library, you can actually have them translated. At the very least, you could localize your docs. So this is an example of moment.js, which is a date-time utility, and it's localized into a few languages. It's very useful. So like I said, a localization was a really huge source of contributors on my project. And that's what our stats look like at the moment. So we've got over 20 locales live on production with 100 in progress and about 1,200 translators. That's 1,266 people contributing and loving your project. That's a big deal. We also learned a lot from the localization process. So this is our HTML5 video editing app. And this is what it looks like for Arabic, which is a right-to-left language, so it's switched around. And it was a really challenging process. But if you do it, it can very often be the only app in that space available in the language or locale. The key here is that instead of thinking about always having to make work for your contributors and be mentors, also learn from them. Learn what you don't know. So all of this may or may not be relevant to you. I talked about localization and user research. But when you go home on Monday, just think of the list of possible blind spots in your project and how you can find contributors to help you out. Beyond that, I think there's one more thing. There's so much cognitive diversity out there, and while we can and should continue to invite people in, we have to do a better job of keeping them around. When I first started to realize that I wanted to contribute code to my project, and I wanted to keep doing it, I couldn't really shake the feeling that the programmers with computer science degrees and the ones that had grown up, hacking consoles and had so much more experience than me already had all the answers. And there have been many times when I questioned not only if I belonged, but also if I was really needed at all. And a lot of the reason I kept going was because people told me I was valuable and that I did have a place in making better software, that my opinion was valued even in areas that I wasn't considered an expert in. So if you take one thing away from this talk, it would be this. Making good software is fucking hard, and it's gonna get even harder in the next 10 years for the open source community. Cognitive diversity is way too valuable for us not to care. So thanks.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Kate.